Tractatus Logico-Fidemus by Dr. Alon Giladi. Elucidate the heaven and the earth. On the facts and the will in rational faith.
C1. Fact is a mental, rational, interpretive statement/conclusion that has not been refuted by another fact about the state of natural and/or abstract things, and what is in between. C.2. The being that creates consciousness is the natural and abstract things and what is in between. C.3. The existing and proper being that creates consciousness is called, in rational faith, heaven and earth. The exemplary interpretive thought about existing being is called natural or abstract facts, about proper being, moral facts, and about being and the limit on its existential side, faithful rational facts. C4. The consciousness that creates being is created by free will and is called meaningful thought and/or free choice. The action that creates being created by free will and meaningful thought is called free choice in meaningful description and/or meaningful creation. The action that creates being and is created by free will from a choice of any options is called decisions. C5. In rational faith, nature is called Jehovah, and it constitutes the natural and abstract things and what is between them, what is present and appropriate in the world of being that is observed and experienced by man through the exemplary unity of interpretation, meaning, and action according to them in nature. The transcendent reality that is indefinite and unattainable by definition is called God in rational faith and is the reality that created being and includes it. C.6. The natural and abstract things and what is between them relate to what is present and appropriate in being. C.7. A fact is a mental determination about being and/or the boundary on its existential side. C.8. A fact is a mental determination about what is present and appropriate in being and/or the boundary on its existential side. C.9. Between being and God, whose existence preceded being and includes it, there is necessarily a boundary. C.10. The boundary is a reality between the reality of the world/being and the reality of God, which is the reality beyond being, which created it and includes it, and therefore he is necessarily present in it. C.11. The boundary is called Jehovah God in rational faith. C.12. The reality of what is present and appropriate in being and on its existential side is the religion of rational faith. The products of the religion of rational faith, together with the existing and the proper, are the exemplary and supreme faith rational being, the unity of the exemplary interpretation, the supreme meaning, and the action according to them in nature and on the boundary of its being. The religion of rational faith is the unity of the being that creates consciousness, the exemplary and supreme consciousness and action that create being. C.13. In practice, there is no rational faith that relates only to being and the boundary. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and we have nothing but from here on. C.14. The designation of the reality between the divine reality and the natural reality as angels is a misnomer, unless we look at this concept as a concept between the reality of the boundary and the reality of nature in the sense of go, that is, walking and walking in the way of faith that, like the angel of Jehovah, is less valuable than Jehovah God, who is the boundary itself on both sides. C.15. The rational, believing being that acts is also called, and the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters. And/or, and God said, let there be light, and there was light, etc. C.16. The boundary includes an aspect on one side that is subject to intellectual interpretation/meaning, being/spirit/ and he said, and an aspect that is not subject to it, God. C.17. The boundary in itself is not necessarily things. The boundary is fixed. The rational believing being changes. C.18. The boundary on the side of the reality of being is subject to intellectual absorption, processing, and creation that is part of being. C.19. A rational believing fact is a mental determination about being and the boundary on its existential side. C.20. A rational believing fact is a product of interpretive thought about what is in being and about the boundary on its existential side. C.21. Thought is things that are the intellectual product of conscious things in being. C.22. Thought is the product of mental reception and processing by a conscious thing. C.23. Thought, whether interpretive or declarative, is the product of things and what is between them in the mind of a conscious living being, which in their complex framework are, for example, humans. C.24. A fact is something that is the intellectual product of a conscious thing in being. 25. Thought is a thing. 26. A fact is a thing. 27. Everything is an object. 28. Every thought is an object. C.29. Every fact is an object. 30. Nothing is in itself a subject. C.31. Pure subjectivity is the product of interpretive thought that is not exemplary about things in being or what is between things or what is beyond being. C.32. Pure subjectivity is the product of conscious thought that does not identify itself with the things it perceives and/or what is between them, and therefore necessarily identifies itself only with itself. C.33. A subject is an object to all objects outside of man, and to man's rational exemplary thought. C.34. Subjectivity is interpretive thought about the world that does not identify itself with what is in being and with the limit on its existential side, and is therefore an illusion. It is the product of interpretive thought that does not dwell on the a priori foundations of thought for the issue of the world and/or the limit, and that seeks an interpretation of the limit also from its divine side. The thought that seeks interpretively the divine reality is the culmination of subjectivity. C.35. Subjectivity can be called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and saw that the tree was good for food and that it was a delight to the eyes and a tree desirable to make one wise. C.36. Consciousness that maintains a creation of absolute exemplary identity with natural and/or abstract things, and what is between them is a pure objective consciousness that is not humanly attainable, but for the aspiration of the rational and faith-rational man. C.37. Pure objectivity is also called, and the Spirit of God hovers over the face of the waters. C.38. There is no pure objectivity from man, but only temporary objective consciousness, until it is refuted by another temporary objective consciousness. C.39. The thought and actions of the greatest prophets, philosophers, and scientists are in the nature of temporary objectivity, which are exemplary interpretations of being and/or the boundary from its existential side, but not the Spirit of God per se. In the case of the prophets, thought also includes thought and sublime meaningful action, which are also called revelation, or and God/Yahweh, God/Yahweh said to the prophet, etc. C.40. There is no consciousness that maintains an absolute exemplary identity with being, since absorption is not the same as being, processing is not the same as being, and the mental creation is not the same as being, but they constitute, together and separately, part of being. How true are the words regarding the acts of thought that are expressed in language? C.41. The aspiration for objectivity, or a higher meaning, is always in rational faith, rational thought consciousness. C.42. Rationality is rational exemplary, or rational higher thought, which is created after sensory intellectual absorption of being and/or the limit on its existential side through mental processing on the a priori elements of thought. C.43. Interpretive theoretical rationality is created through sensory intellectual absorption and processing on the a priori theoretical elements and theoretical categories according to Kant, with necessary modifications, hereinafter, the foundations of theoretical intellectual thought. C.44. Interpretive moral rationality is created through sensory intellectual absorption and processing on the foundations of theoretical thought, with the addition of the a priori moral elements and moral categories, hereinafter, the foundations of moral intellectual thought. C.45. Interpretive faith rationality is created through sensory intellectual absorption and processing on the foundations of theoretical and moral thought, as well as the a priori faith-based elements and faith-based categories, hereinafter, the foundations of faith intellectual thought. C.46. Meaningful intellectual rationality for a given issue is created through sensory intellectual absorption and processing on the a priori elements of thought according to the issue, which are theoretical intellectual and/or moral intellectual and/or faith intellectual, and on the a priori sensory intellectual elements together and their respective categories, hereinafter, the foundations of meaningful thought. C.47. A fact is temporary objective consciousness. C.48. There is no subjective fact. C.49. A fact is not the same as a thing in being or at the limit, and does not refer to what is beyond being. C.50. Fact is not the same as thought. C.51. A fact is expressed through language. C.52. Language is a means. C.53. Language that becomes a principle is equivalent to idolatry, in which the material as such is transformed from a means to a principle and value. Language in practice becomes idolatry even when its products, which are predetermined in a non-exemplary manner, become an asserted and defining objectivist element of faith and/or morality. C.54. Language is not the same as thought and is included in it. C.55. Thought is not the same as being and is included in it. C.56. The search for truth is not found in language per se, but through it. C.57. An analogy between verses per se, as Frege and his followers do, does not reveal truth, and on the contrary, it is not found on the path to truth, but on the path of distancing oneself from it. C.58. An equation on the way to truth is an intellectual masterful interpretive processing of the absorption of being and/or the boundary from its existential side, and at the same time, a higher intelligent meaningful processing of this absorption out of an aspiration on the one hand for intellectual masterful identification, and on the other hand for a higher intelligent harmony with them that creates a new old being. C.59. An equation on the way to truth in the language of the alphabet is a combination of exemplary interpretation and sublime meaning between letters that create words, and between words that create sentences, and the world in the reality of being and/or the boundary that are absorbed by thought. C.60. An equation on the way to truth in the language of the alphabet that will not be achieved by definition is the exemplary combination between the being that creates thought and the voluntary consciousness that creates being. C.61. In language, there are a priori elements of language, within the framework of language, such as letters or their combination as words, lines, characters, etc., and basic images that are not explanations or descriptions and explanations, and natural and abstract creations. C.62. The elements of the means of thought language are not the verses and not the words, but its a priori elements, the sounds, the pictures. C.63. A fact is expressed in language only in descriptions and/or in natural and/or abstract explanations. C.64. Natural and abstract descriptions and explanations in language are not the same as thought, and are not the same as a thing in being and/or on the border. C.65. Natural and abstract interpretive descriptions and explanations that establish facts are always found between an upper pole of pure and unattainable objectivity and a lower pole of erroneous subjective consciousness. C.66. I think, therefore I exist. C.67. I feel means I exist, and something exists beyond me. C.68. I feel you speak means you exist. C.69. I want means I am free. C.70. I am free means I am equal. C.71. You exist means you want. C.72. You want means you are free, means you are equal. C.73. I and you are free and equal means we exist, want, and feel. C.74. Buber's I and you is a logical starting point that requires correction. C.75. There is no fundamental real difference between I and you and I and this. The I who thinks about the foreign and alienated self that is imposed on him and exploited by him versus the I who unites with the intellectual and emotional you are various derivatives of the absorption, processing, and creation of voluntary thought. Therefore, a corrective diagnosis is required for Buber. C.94. The will, by definition, is not a primary mental processing of the senses, which is primary knowledge. C.95. The will, by definition, is not knowledge. C.96. The will is what causes me to process the initial mental knowledge into understanding or into creation, into interpretation or meaning. C.97. The will is what causes me to think beyond the initial knowledge. C.98. The will is the cause of mental creation after the initial absorption of the senses. C.99. The will is the cause of creative thought, interpretive and/or meaningful, which includes the knowledge that goes beyond the first sensory knowledge and its processing. C.100. The will is the cause of choosing between options, both mental and practical. C.101. Thought creates a fact conclusion and/or creation from the decision of the will to do so or not to do so. C.102. The will causes the fact. C.103. The will causes a decision between options of action. C.104. Freedom of thought causes moral action. C.105. Freedom of thought causes creative thought. C.106. Freedom of thought precedes creative thought and moral action, and is a condition for them. C.107. Freedom of thought changes being. C.108. The will changes being. C.109. Will is not part of being. C.110. Thought is part of being. C.111. Will is not part of thought. C.112. Will is not part of feeling. C.113. Will can precede thought. It can be during it. It can be after it. It can be influenced by thought and/or feeling, but is not dependent on them by definition. C.114. The relationship between will and being is given between two poles. On the one hand, the freedom of will in itself does not depend on being, and on the other hand, without knowledge of being, there is no possibility of free essential, fundamental value, free actual, related to reality, and free true, striving for truth, choice. C.115. Will is necessarily influenced by something in being, since it is concerned with choosing between possibilities in being. Without knowledge of possibilities in being, there is no possibility of a real/true/exemplary choice between them. C.116. The will never depends in its essence in itself on things or what is between them, as distinct from their influence on the way it operates. C.117. Being creates consciousness. C.118. The will creates being. C.119. The will is in itself free, uniform, and complete in terms of its essence and independence, but it is in this world in terms of the influence of being on its determination and the influence of its determination on being. C.120. The will is not an object. C.121. The will is not a subject. C.122. The will is not things and is not what is between them. C.123. The definition of the will in terms of its freedom is beyond the capacity of human cognition. C.124. The will is the manifestation of reality that is beyond the reality of being in being. 3. C.125. The will, in terms of its freedom, is what cannot be spoken of in being, in contrast to thought in its various forms: knowledge, conclusion, decision, science, morality, and faith. C.126. The free will is what is called in rational faith the Spirit of God. The limit is called Jehovah God. The will is included in the limit. The limit is fixed and common to all being. Free will is fixed and common to all those who have will. The will does not have subjects or subjectivity in being. C.127. In being, there are only objects and objectivity, except for the will, whose freedom does not belong to the reality of being, and whose existence stems from thought about the limit between being and what precedes it, and what is beyond it and includes it. C.128. There is no darkness in being, but only light and the absence of light. C.129. There is no evil in being, but only good and the absence of good. C.130. The good for its time is the explanation that seeks in being to be pure/universal, and action is based on it. The very good is the best at its peak for its time, and it is not surprising that it contains within itself the concept of man, and its source in rational faith is not in God, but in and fear God, meaning in Jehovah God, meaning in the limit. C.131. Doing evil is the choice of the will in the absence of good. C.132. The claim that facts are being, or that man is what establishes being, or that being creates consciousness, is arrogance, and even a backward step of error upon error upon error in the history of human thought. C.133. The absolute good is the absolute truth. It is the good without the connecting and. C.134. The absolute good is the pure, complete, existing, and proper. C.135. The absolute good is God. C.136. Justice is the absolute, proper good. C.137. There is no justice and injustice. There is justice and injustice. C.138. Since man never knows the good in its entirety, by definition he acts both in good and in the absence of good, which are called, there is no good without evil, and there is no evil without good. C.139. Since man never chooses the absolute good, which is beyond his attainment, by definition he always acts both in justice and in injustice. C.140. Man's purpose in striving for the absolute truth, which he will never reach. C. 141. Man's purpose in proper is the aspiration for the absolute justice, which he will never reach. C. 142. The difference between the sons of God and the sons of men, for whom my spirit will never judge a man according to his appearance, is, in an ideal way, between the men of rational faith truth and those who are not such. C. 143. In a practical way, the difference between the sons of God and the sons of men is the difference between the men of rational faith and the men of materialism, or the men of subjective beliefs in their decadent development. C. 144. Therefore, in the pure sense of the proper things, there is no righteous man who chooses righteousness, and it is bad for him, and there is no wicked man who chooses unrighteously, and it is good for him. C. 145. Therefore, in the practical sense of the proper things, there is always a righteous man who is bad for him to a certain extent, in the sense of no righteousness, and always a wicked man who is good for him to a certain extent, in the sense of a certain proper truth. C. 146. The righteous, by definition, is always on the path to good, while the wicked, or unrighteous, is always on the path to non-good. C. 147. The solution to Job's riddle on the issue of righteous and wicked is found in one and only verse. And it came to pass on that day that the sons of God came to contend with Jehovah, and Satan also came among you to contend with Jehovah. C. 148. The search for facts is an attempt, within the interpretive framework of the purpose of consciousness, to create a rational exemplary identification with being and with the limit on its existential side, but never what is beyond it, that is, on its divine side. C. 149. A thing with consciousness that is finite cannot reach the infinite, even if it aspires to it, since nothing can by definition reach what is beyond its reality. C. 150. The facts in rational faith will never enjoy full identification with the truth, since truth is necessarily God, that is, being and what is beyond it. The facts in theoretical reason will never enjoy full identification with the truth, since truth in a world without God is the infinite being that includes the finite consciousness, which includes the finite thought, which creates the facts as a partial identification for its time. C. 151. The facts will never enjoy full identification with what is and is proper in being. The facts are the result of a thing with consciousness that is finite and not identical to them, while being is the result of a reality that is beyond it, before it, or within it in the action of free will. C. 152. The purpose of creating the facts is the mental aspiration for the pure objectivity of what is and is proper. The purpose of creating facts is called in the Spinozist world of nature. Understanding nature/reality/being in itself, and in rational faith, understanding what is and is appropriate in being and the limit of its existential side. C. 153. The proper mode of action according to the facts that strive for pure objectivity of what is and is appropriate is called in the Spinozist world of nature the virtues. The proper mode of action according to the facts in rational faith is called in a general way to serve and preserve it, and in a general specific way, the burden of Torah and the commandments. C. 154. The purpose of facts, conclusions about what is and is appropriate in the way of truth. C. 155. The purpose of the will in free choice is an action in exemplary interpretive thought and in meaningful thought, and choosing the appropriate good over the inappropriate bad, or, in other words, right over wrong. C. 156. Pure objectivity is beyond man. Pure objectivity in rational faith is given to God. C. 157. The aspiration for the pure objectivity of what is and is appropriate is the unattainable goal of man. C. 158. Leave to God what is for God. C. 159. Calculate and do for man what is for being and the limit of his being. C. 160. Thought in its varieties and subject ranges between the poles of creating a simulated subjectivity and between creating a simulated objectivity. C. 161. Being creates consciousness of the type of knowledge and fact, while new old being is created by the will through consciousness of the type of meaning and voluntary decision/choice between action options. C. 162. Being creates consciousness of the type of knowledge and fact through language, while new old being is created by the will through consciousness of the type of meaning and voluntary decision/choice between action options given to interpretation through language. There is no pure interpretation that constitutes complete identification with being and/or the limit. Every interpretation holds the possibility of meaning. Everything holds the possibility of meaning. C. 163. Every sentence has meaning. C. 164. Every word has meaning. C. 165. Every letter has meaning. C. 166. Since interpretation in the way of truth is an exemplary product of thought of a type of identification with being and/or the boundary on its existential side, two types of interpretation must be identified in it, which are descriptive interpretation and explanatory interpretation. C. 167. For every sentence there is an interpretation of a type of description, and for every word there is an interpretation of a type of description regarding the image it represents. For every letter there is an interpretation of a type of description of an image and sound, etc. C. 168. It follows from this that in every exemplary product of interpretive thought, there is always an interpretation of a type of description, but not in every exemplary product of interpretive thought there is an interpretation of a type of explanation. C. 169. Explanation is the creation of a fact through the identification of thought with being and/or the boundary on its existential side that is not just a sound or an image, but it is required for something beyond them, for the relationship, the regularity between them and being. 3. C. 170. An interpretation of the type of description is a simple. 3. C. 171. An interpretation of the type of explanation or description and explanation is a sermon. 3. C. 172. Every meaning is in the form of a sermon. 3. C. 173. Therefore, in every exemplary product of thought, there is a sermon of the type of meaning and a simple of the type of description. 3. C. 174. Therefore, in every product of thought that approaches the truth, there will be a fact that is a simple of the type of description, a fact that is a perfect sermon of the type of explanation, and a creation that is a sublime sermon of the type of meaning. 3. C. 175. Therefore, the path of truth on which man walks is the unity of the sublime meaning and the exemplary interpretation. 3. C. 176. Therefore, the path of truth to which man aspires is the unity of being that creates consciousness and volitional consciousness that creates being.